The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of the Afghan mountains as Lieutenant Jake Morrison adjusted his rifle scope one final time. His team of 6 Navy SEALs had been moving through the treacherous landscape for 3 days, tracking a high-value target who had been coordinating attacks against coalition forces. The intelligence was solid, but Jake knew that in this business, solid intelligence could turn deadly in seconds. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos crouched beside a boulder, her eyes scanning the valley below through binoculars. She had been with Jake's team for 2 years, and her instincts had saved their lives more times than anyone could count. Something felt wrong about this mission from the start. The terrain was too open, the target's location too convenient, and the lack of enemy activity in the area made her skin crawl. "Boss, I'm getting a bad feeling about this," Maria whispered into her radio. "This whole setup stinks like a trap." Jake understood her concern. They had received word that their target, a Taliban commander known as the Ghost, was holed up in a small compound just 2 kilometers ahead. The Ghost had earned his nickname by disappearing whenever coalition forces got close, leaving behind only destruction and dead soldiers. This time, intelligence suggested he was injured and unable to move quickly. Corporal Danny Kim, the team's communication specialist, was having trouble maintaining contact with their base. The mountains created dead zones for radio signals, and they had been operating with limited communication for the past 6 hours. His equipment was top-notch, but even the best technology struggled against the harsh Afghan terrain. "Comms are sketchy, Lieutenant," Danny reported. "I can get through maybe 1 out of every 5 attempts." The team also included Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, a demolitions expert who could turn everyday items into powerful weapons; Petty Officer Second Class Alex Chen, their medic who had patched up more wounded soldiers than he cared to remember; and Corporal Sarah Thompson, a sniper whose accuracy was legendary even among the elite SEAL community. As they approached the target area, Jake called for a tactical halt. The compound sat in a natural bowl surrounded by hills on 3 sides. It was the perfect place for an ambush, but it was also the only way to reach their target. The building itself was a typical Afghan structure, made of mud, brick, and stone, with small windows and a flat roof that provided excellent defensive positions. "Thompson, I want you on overwatch," Jake commanded. "Find a position on the ridge where you can cover our approach and retreat." Sarah nodded and began moving toward a rocky outcrop that would give her a clear view of the compound and the surrounding area. Her Barrett M82 rifle was already loaded and ready. She had made shots at over 1,000 meters before, but something about this mission made her check her equipment twice. The team spent an hour observing the compound through their scopes and binoculars. There was no visible movement, no signs of life, and no indication that anyone was inside. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional whistle of wind through the rocks. "Too quiet," Rodriguez muttered. "In all my tours, I've never seen a Taliban compound this quiet during daylight hours." Jake knew his explosives expert was right. Even abandoned compounds usually showed some signs of recent activity: footprints, disturbed dust, or equipment left behind. This place looked like it had been empty for weeks, but their intelligence insisted the Ghost was inside. Chen checked his medical supplies one more time. His backpack contained enough trauma supplies to keep a wounded soldier alive for hours. But in a firefight, sometimes hours felt like seconds. He had seen too many good soldiers die because medical help arrived just minutes too late. The decision had to be made. They could abort the mission and return to base with nothing to show for 3 days of hard movement through enemy territory, or they could trust their intelligence and move forward with the assault. Jake looked at each member of his team, seeing the same mixture of determination and concern in their eyes. "Danny, try to raise base one more time," Jake ordered. "I want them to know our position before we move in." Kim worked with his radio for several minutes, adjusting frequencies and repositioning his antenna. Finally, he managed to establish a weak connection with their operations center. "Falcon Base, this is Eagle 6, he transmitted. "We are in position and preparing to assault the target. Request permission to proceed." The response came through heavy static. "Eagle 6, you are cleared to proceed. Be advised, drone support is unavailable due to weather conditions in your area." The lack of drone support meant they would be going in blind, without the benefit of overhead surveillance that had become standard for these types of operations. It also meant that if things went wrong, Help would be a long time coming. Jake made the final equipment check with his team. Each SEAL carried an M4 carbine with extra magazines, grenades, medical supplies, and specialized equipment for their role. Their body armor was designed to stop rifle rounds, but Jake knew that in a prolonged firefight, even the best armor could fail. As they prepared to move toward the compound, Sarah's voice crackled over the radio from her overwatch position. "I've got movement in the hills to the north. Looks like 3, maybe 4 individuals moving between the rocks." Jake felt his stomach tighten. If there were enemies in the hills, it meant their target location was indeed occupied, but it also meant they were walking into a potentially dangerous situation with limited escape routes. "Can you identify them?" Jake asked. "Negative, too much heat shimmer and rock cover, but they're definitely armed and moving with purpose." The team had trained for situations exactly like this. Each member knew their role, understood the risks, and was prepared to fight their way out if necessary. But training and reality were two different things, and Jake could feel the weight of responsibility for his team's lives settling on his shoulders. Rodriguez checked his demolition charges one final time. If they needed to breach the compound walls quickly, his explosives would create the opening they needed. But explosions also announced their presence to every enemy fighter within miles. "All right, listen up," Jake said quietly. "We stick to the plan. Santos and I take point. Rodriguez and Chen follow at 10 meters. Kim stays with communications and Thompson provides overwatch. If this goes bad, we fight our way back to Thompson's position and call for extraction." The team acknowledged the plan with quiet nods. They had worked together long enough that words were often unnecessary. Each SEAL understood that in the next hour, they would either complete their mission successfully or find themselves fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. As they began their final approach to the compound, none of them realized they were walking directly into the most sophisticated ambush any of them had ever encountered. The approach to the compound required crossing 50 meters of open ground that offered no cover except for a few scattered rocks. Jake Morrison felt exposed as he led Maria Santos across the barren space, knowing that enemy eyes could be watching from any of the surrounding hills. Every step felt deliberate and dangerous, like walking across a minefield where one wrong move could trigger catastrophe. Behind them, Mike Rodriguez carried his demolition pack, ready to blast through the compound's main door if it proved to be reinforced or booby-trapped. His experience in Iraq and previous Afghanistan deployments had taught him that Taliban fighters often turned their hideouts into deadly mazes filled with improvised explosive devices and hidden weapons caches. Kim struggled to maintain radio contact as they moved. The surrounding mountains created a natural communications dead zone, and the specialized encryption equipment they used made it even more difficult to establish clear connections with their base. He managed to send brief status updates, but detailed communication was impossible. "Eagle 6 to Falcon Base, beginning compound approach," he whispered into his microphone, hoping the message would get through the static and interference. Alex Chen watched the compound's windows for any sign of movement, while simultaneously monitoring his teammates for signs of injury or stress. As the team medic, he had learned to observe not just obvious wounds but also the subtle indicators that soldiers were reaching their physical or mental limits. 3 days of hard movement through hostile territory had taken its toll on everyone. From her overwatch position, Sarah Thompson tracked the suspicious movement she had spotted in the northern hills. Through her high-powered scope, she could see at least 4 armed figures positioning themselves among the rocks. Their movements were coordinated and professional, suggesting they were experienced fighters rather than local militia. "Boss, those contacts in the hills are definitely military trained," she reported. "They're setting up what looks like interlocking fields of fire." Jake processed this information while continuing his approach. Interlocking fields of fire meant that multiple enemy positions could cover the same area, making it nearly impossible for his team to find safe cover if shooting started. It was a classic ambush technique that required significant planning and coordination. The compound's main door was made of heavy wood reinforced with metal bands. Jake could see that it was slightly ajar, which immediately raised his suspicions. In his experience, Taliban fighters never left doors open unless they wanted someone to enter. It was either an invitation to a trap or a sign that the building had been abandoned in haste. Santos moved to the left side of the door while Jake took position on the right. They had performed this type of entry hundreds of times in training and dozens of times in real combat situations. The procedure was so automatic that they barely needed to communicate their movements to each other. Rodriguez prepared a small breaching charge, while Chen readied his medical supplies for immediate use. Both men knew that the next few minutes would determine whether this mission ended successfully or turned into a desperate fight for survival. Kim continued his attempts to establish communications with their base, knowing that if they encountered serious resistance, air support or reinforcements would be their only hope of survival. The mountains that provided perfect hiding places for their enemies also made it nearly impossible for help to reach them quickly. "I'm getting intermittent contact with base," Kim reported, "but I can't guarantee they're receiving our full transmissions." Jake made the decision to proceed. His team had come too far and risked too much to abort the mission based on suspicions alone. The intelligence about the Ghost's presence was solid, and capturing or eliminating such a high-value target could save countless coalition lives. He signaled for Santos to prepare for entry. She responded by adjusting her grip on her rifle and positioning herself to cover the interior of the building once the door was opened. Her movements were smooth and professional, the result of years of training and combat experience. Thompson's voice crackled over the radio again. "I count 6 hostiles now, definitely setting up an ambush. They've got RPGs and what looks like a machine gun." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. 6 enemy fighters with rocket-propelled grenades and automatic weapons could pin down Jake's team indefinitely, especially if they had prepared positions in the hills. The compound was beginning to feel less like a target and more like a kill zone. Rodriguez attached his breaching charge to the door's hinges, preparing to blow it open if it proved to be locked or reinforced. The explosive was small but powerful enough to destroy most typical doors without bringing down the entire building. Chen noticed that his hands were starting to shake slightly, a normal physiological response to the adrenaline and stress of combat preparation. He took a deep breath and focused on his training, knowing that his teammates' lives might depend on his ability to remain calm and focused in the coming minutes. Jake looked at his watch and realized they had been exposed in the open for nearly 10 minutes. In combat terms, that was an eternity. If enemy fighters were indeed preparing an ambush, they would have had plenty of time to get into position and coordinate their attack. "Thompson, can you take out any of those hostiles from your position?" Jake asked. "Negative, boss. They're using the terrain perfectly. I can see them, but I don't have clear shots without repositioning, and moving would expose me." The tactical situation was becoming increasingly complex. Jake's team was trapped between a potentially hostile compound and confirmed enemy positions in the surrounding hills. Their communications were unreliable, air support was unavailable, and their sniper couldn't engage the threats she had identified. Santos tested the compound door gently, finding that it opened easily on well-oiled hinges. The ease of entry was another red flag that suggested either abandonment or a carefully prepared trap. She could smell something inside the building, a mixture of cooking spices, unwashed clothing, and something else she couldn't identify. "I'm picking up human scent," she whispered. "Someone's been here recently, maybe within the last few hours." Jake weighed his options quickly. They could retreat and call for reinforcements, but that would mean losing their target and potentially allowing the Ghost to escape again. They could proceed with the original plan despite the obvious dangers, or they could modify their approach to account for the changed tactical situation. Rodriguez suggested a compromise. "Boss, what if we toss a flashbang through the door first? If anyone's inside, it'll disorient them. If it's empty, we'll know pretty quickly." The idea had merit, but flashbang grenades were loud and would announce their presence to every enemy fighter within miles. Once they used one, stealth would no longer be an option, and they would have to be prepared for an immediate firefight. Kim managed to establish brief contact with their base. "Falcon Base, Eagle 6. We are at the compound and have identified multiple hostiles in overwatch positions. Request immediate air support." The response was barely audible through the static. "Eagle 6, no air assets available. You are authorized to proceed or abort at team leader's discretion." Jake realized that his team was truly on their own. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, they would have to handle it without outside help. The weight of command had never felt heavier as he prepared to make a decision that could save or doom his entire team. Jake Morrison made his decision with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through 3 combat deployments. They would proceed with the mission, but with modified tactics that accounted for the enemy presence in the hills. He signaled Rodriguez to prepare the flashbang grenade while Santos repositioned herself to cover multiple angles of the compound's interior. "Thompson, I need you to start taking shots at those hostiles the moment we breach," Jake commanded. "Even if you can't hit them, make them keep their heads down." Sarah Thompson adjusted her position slightly to get better angles on the enemy fighters she had been tracking. Her Barrett rifle was loaded with armor-piercing rounds capable of penetrating most cover the Taliban fighters might be using. She would have to work quickly once the shooting started. Rodriguez pulled the pin from his flashbang grenade and prepared to toss it through the compound's open door. The device would produce a blinding flash and deafening bang designed to disorient anyone inside the building for several crucial seconds. Those seconds could mean the difference between a successful entry and walking into a death trap. Chen readied his medical supplies and positioned himself where he could quickly reach any wounded teammate. His experience treating combat injuries had taught him that the first few minutes after someone was shot were critical. Having medical supplies immediately available could save lives that might otherwise be lost to preventable blood loss. Danny Kim made one final attempt to establish solid communications with their base. If this mission went wrong, he wanted to ensure that someone knew their exact location and situation. The families of his teammates deserved to know what happened to their loved ones if the worst occurred. Falcon Base, Eagle 6, grid coordinates 41S MB 123456, beginning compound assault now. If you lose contact, assume we need immediate extraction assistance. The response was weak but audible. Roger, Eagle 6, coordinates logged. Good hunting. Jake took a deep breath and nodded to Rodriguez. The explosives expert lobbed the flashbang through the door and immediately turned away to protect his own eyes and ears from the device's effects. The grenade bounced once on the floor inside the compound before detonating with a brilliant flash and thunderous boom that echoed off the surrounding mountains. The moment the flashbang exploded, Jake and Santos rushed through the door into the compound's main room. What they found inside made Jake's blood run cold. The room was empty of people, but it was filled with evidence of recent occupation. Sleeping mats were arranged around a central fire pit, weapons cleaning supplies were scattered on a low table, and cooking pots still contained warm food. More disturbing was what Santos discovered along the walls. Multiple fighting positions had been prepared with sandbags and ammunition caches. The compound hadn't been a hideout for the Ghost. It had been converted into a fortress designed to hold off attacking forces. They had walked directly into a prepared defensive position. "Boss, this place is set up for a siege," Santos reported. Multiple firing positions, ammunition stockpiles, and what looks like tunnel entrances in the back rooms. Thompson's rifle cracked from her overwatch position as she engaged the enemy fighters in the hills. Her first shot struck sparks off a rock inches from one fighter's head, forcing him to duck behind cover. The sound of her rifle was immediately answered by automatic weapons fire from multiple positions. "Contact. Multiple hostiles engaging from the north and east hills," Thompson reported while working the bolt of her rifle to chamber another round. "I'm taking heavy fire and need to relocate." The trap had been sprung. Jake realized that the Ghost had never been in this compound. Instead, the Taliban commander had used intelligence about the SEAL team's mission to set up an elaborate ambush. The compound was bait, and Jake's team had taken it completely. Rodriguez immediately began setting up defensive positions inside the compound while Chen found cover behind the thick mud brick walls. The building's construction, designed to protect against the harsh Afghan climate, also provided excellent protection against small arms fire. Kim established a communications post in the corner of the main room and began frantically calling for support. "Falcon Base, Eagle 6, we are under heavy attack at the compound. Multiple hostiles in prepared positions. Request immediate air support and extraction assistance." The response was immediate but devastating. "Eagle 6, understood. No air assets available for minimum 4 hours. Extraction helicopter will require significant time to reach your position. Hold your ground and prepare for extended engagement." 4 hours might as well have been 4 days. Jake knew his team couldn't hold out against a determined enemy assault for that length of time, especially without air support or the possibility of immediate reinforcement. They would have to find another way out of this situation. Automatic weapons fire began striking the compound walls, sending chips of stone and mud brick flying through the air. The enemy fighters had clearly been positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that covered all approaches to and from the compound. Jake's team was effectively trapped. Thompson's voice came over the radio again, this time strained with effort. "I'm moving to secondary position. Count at least 8 hostiles now, maybe more. They've got this place surrounded." Santos discovered the tunnel entrances in the back rooms of the compound. The tunnels appeared to lead deeper into the mountain, possibly connecting to other defensive positions or providing escape routes for the Taliban fighters who had originally occupied the building. "These tunnels could be our way out," she suggested to Jake, "but they could also be full of booby traps or let us straight into more enemies." Rodriguez finished setting up their defensive positions and began inventorying their ammunition supplies. Each team member carried several magazines for their primary weapons, plus grenades and specialized equipment. But in a prolonged firefight, ammunition consumption could be enormous. "We've got maybe 30 minutes of heavy fighting before we start running low on ammo," he reported. "After that, we'll be down to pistols and whatever we can find in this place." Chen treated a minor cut on Santos's face where flying stone had grazed her during the initial barrage. The injury was superficial, but it reminded everyone how quickly situation could deteriorate from minor wounds to life-threatening injuries. The sound of gunfire continued to echo through the mountains as Thompson engaged targets from her new position. Her accurate rifle fire was keeping some of the enemy fighters pinned down, but she was vastly outnumbered and would eventually be overwhelmed if the situation didn't change. Jake studied the compound's layout and began formulating a plan. They couldn't stay where they were indefinitely, and they couldn't fight their way out through the main entrance without taking heavy casualties. The tunnels might offer a way out, but exploring them would be dangerous and time-consuming. "Rodriguez, how much explosive material do you have left?" Jake asked. "Enough to bring down most of this building, or maybe create a diversion somewhere else," Rodriguez replied. "What are you thinking, boss?" Jake was thinking about survival. His team had walked into a carefully planned trap, but they were still alive and still fighting. The mission to capture the ghost was obviously blown, but getting his people home safely was now the only objective that mattered. Kim managed to establish better communications with their base and began providing detailed information about their tactical situation. The more information base commanders had, the better they could plan rescue operations or coordinate support activities. Outside the compound, the enemy fire was becoming more organized and intense. Jake could hear commands being shouted in Pashto as the Taliban fighters coordinated their assault. It was clear that they were dealing with experienced combat veterans rather than untrained militia fighters. The intensity of enemy fire increased dramatically as more Taliban fighters joined the assault on the compound. Jake Morrison could hear the distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles mixed with the deeper rumble of machine gun fire. Bullets struck the mud brick walls with steady impacts, creating clouds of dust and debris that filled the air inside their defensive position. Sarah Thompson's situation on the ridge was becoming desperate. From her overwatch position, she could see enemy fighters moving to flank her location. Her accurate rifle fire had eliminated 2 Taliban fighters and wounded at least 1 more, but the remaining attackers were using superior numbers to overwhelm her position. "Boss, I've got multiple hostiles moving up the ridge toward my position," she reported while chambering another round. "I can hold them for maybe 10 more minutes, then I'll have to displace or they'll overrun me." Jake understood that losing Thompson's overwatch fire would be catastrophic for his team's survival. Her position allowed her to see enemy movements that were invisible from inside the compound, and her accurate shooting was the only thing preventing the Taliban fighters from advancing closer to the building. Maria Santos explored the tunnel system more thoroughly, discovering that the passages led to at least 3 different exits scattered around the mountainside. The tunnels were narrow and would force the team to move in single file, making them vulnerable to ambush if enemy fighters were waiting at the other ends. "These tunnels definitely connect to other positions," she informed Jake. "I can see light coming from multiple directions, but I can't tell if they're clear or if we'd be walking into more trouble." Mike Rodriguez continued to manage their ammunition supplies while preparing defensive positions throughout the compound. He had discovered several caches of Taliban ammunition and weapons, including rocket-propelled grenades that could be devastating if used against coalition forces. "The bad news is they've got enough ammo here to fight for days," Rodriguez reported. "The good news is so do we. If we can figure out how to use their equipment." Danny Kim maintained communications with their base, while monitoring Taliban radio frequencies to gather intelligence about enemy movements and intentions. His language skills allowed him to understand some of the radio traffic, providing valuable information about the size and organization of the attacking force. "I'm picking up chatter about bringing up mortars," Kim reported grimly. "If they start dropping indirect fire on this position, these walls won't protect us. Mortar fire would change everything." The compound's thick walls provided excellent protection against rifle and machine gun fire, but they couldn't withstand the explosive impact of mortar rounds. If the Taliban fighters had access to mortars, Jake's team would have only minutes before their defensive position became a death trap. Alex Chen treated minor injuries on Rodriguez and Kim, where flying debris had cut them during the initial assault. The wounds were superficial, but Chen knew that in extended combat situations, even minor injuries could become serious problems if they weren't properly addressed. The sound of Thompson's rifle fire had become irregular, suggesting she was running low on ammunition or having difficulty acquiring targets. Her position on the ridge was nearly a kilometer from the compound, making it impossible for the rest of the team to resupply her or provide direct support. Jake made a difficult decision. Thompson would have to abandon her overwatch position and attempt to reach the compound before enemy fighters overran her location. Without her covering fire, the team would be fighting blind, but losing their sniper entirely would be even worse. "Thompson, begin displacement toward our position," Jake commanded. "Use whatever cover you can find, but get here fast. We'll provide suppressing fire when you get close." Sarah Thompson acknowledged the order and began the dangerous process of withdrawing from her position while under enemy fire. She would have to cover nearly a kilometer of open ground while carrying her heavy rifle and ammunition, all while enemy fighters tried to hunt her down. Rodriguez prepared to provide covering fire for Thompson's withdrawal by setting up one of the captured Taliban machine guns in a window facing the ridge. The weapon was unfamiliar, but his experience with various small arms allowed him to quickly figure out its operation. Santos continued mapping the tunnel system, marking potential escape routes and identifying possible ambush points. Her reconnaissance was vital for planning their eventual withdrawal from the compound, whether through the tunnels or by fighting their way out through the main entrance. Kim intercepted more Taliban radio traffic indicating that additional fighters were moving toward their position. The attacking force was larger than initially estimated and appeared to be receiving reinforcements from other areas. What had started as an ambush was becoming a major engagement. "Boss, I'm hearing references to at least 20 fighters now, maybe more," Kim reported. "And they're definitely bringing up heavy weapons." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Jake's team of 6 SEALs was facing an enemy force more than 3 times their size, with more fighters arriving and heavy weapons being brought into the battle. Their ammunition would eventually run out, and help was still hours away. Chen finished treating the minor injuries and began preparing for more serious casualties. In a firefight of this intensity, it was only a matter of time before someone was seriously wounded. His medical supplies were adequate for treating several wounded soldiers, but he would need to work quickly and efficiently. Thompson's voice crackled over the radio as she began her dangerous movement toward the compound. "Beginning displacement now. I can see at least 4 hostiles trying to intercept my route. Going to need that covering fire in about 2 minutes." Rodriguez opened fire with the captured machine gun, sending long bursts toward the ridge where enemy fighters were pursuing Thompson. The unfamiliar weapon handled differently than his usual equipment, but his experience allowed him to walk his fire onto target effectively. Santos made a disturbing discovery in one of the tunnel side passages. The Taliban fighters had prepared the compound not just as a defensive position, but as a trap specifically designed to capture or kill American Special Operations Forces. Evidence suggested they had been planning this ambush for weeks. "Boss, this whole thing was a setup from the beginning," she reported. "They've got maps of our base, photos of our helicopters, and intelligence reports that could only have come from someone with access to our operations." The implications were staggering. If the Taliban had detailed intelligence about SEAL operations, it meant they had either intercepted communications or had a source inside the coalition forces. The Ghost hadn't been their target. Jake's team had been the target all along. Kim's communications equipment suddenly came alive with clear radio traffic from their base. "Eagle 6, Falcon Base. We have intercepted enemy communications indicating large-scale Taliban operation in your area. Be advised you may be facing regimental strength opposition. Regimental strength meant hundreds of enemy fighters, not the dozens they had already identified. Jake realized that his team wasn't just trapped in a compound. They were at the center of the largest Taliban operation in the region for months. The Ghost had used them as bait to draw American forces into a carefully prepared killing ground. Thompson's rifle fire could be heard getting closer as she fought her way toward the compound. Enemy fire was increasing in intensity as more Taliban fighters joined the assault. The battle for the compound was entering a new phase, and Jake knew the next few minutes would determine whether his team survived or became casualties in the Ghost's elaborate trap. The first mortar round exploded 50 meters from the compound, sending a shower of rocks and dirt cascading down the mountainside. Jake Morrison felt the concussion wave through the thick walls as he realized their worst fears were coming true. The Taliban fighters had indeed brought indirect fire weapons to the battle, and it was only a matter of time before they found the correct range. Sarah Thompson was still fighting her way toward the compound when the mortar attack began. She dove behind a boulder as shrapnel from the first round scattered across the slope above her position. Her retreat was becoming a running battle as Taliban fighters closed in from multiple directions, using the mortar fire to mask their advance. "Second round incoming," Rodriguez shouted as he spotted the telltale flash from the mortar position in the distant hills. The round landed closer this time, maybe 30 meters from the compound's main wall. Dust and debris rained down through the ceiling as the building shook from the impact. Maria Santos continued her reconnaissance of the tunnel system, but the mortar attack changed her priorities. The tunnels might provide protection from indirect fire as well as an escape route, but she needed to determine quickly whether they were structurally sound enough to withstand nearby explosions. Danny Kim's radio crackled with urgent communications from their base. "Eagle 6, we have UAV footage showing large numbers of hostiles converging on your position. Count approximately 60 fighters with more approaching from the east." 60 fighters represented a force large enough to overwhelm even the most determined defense. Jake understood that traditional defensive tactics wouldn't work against such overwhelming numbers. They needed to change their strategy from passive defense to something more aggressive and unpredictable. "Alex," Chen moved his medical supplies to the most protected area of the compound, as mortar rounds continued to fall around their position. The building's thick walls provided good protection against shrapnel, but a direct hit would be catastrophic. He needed to be ready to treat casualties while protecting his equipment. The third mortar round struck the compound's outer wall, blowing a hole large enough for a person to crawl through. The explosion filled the main room with dust and smoke, temporarily blinding the defenders and making it difficult to breathe. Jake could hear enemy fighters shouting to each other as they prepared to exploit the breach. Rodriguez responded to the wall breach by placing a demolition charge near the opening. If enemy fighters tried to use the hole to enter the compound, he could detonate the charge and eliminate them. But the explosion would also weaken the building's structure and potentially bring down part of the roof. Thompson's voice came over the radio, strained with exertion. "I'm 200 meters out and taking heavy fire. Multiple hostiles between me and your position. I need immediate suppressing fire, or I'm not going to make it." Santos abandoned her tunnel reconnaissance and joined Rodriguez in providing covering fire for Thompson's final approach. They coordinated their shooting to create a corridor of suppressing fire that would allow their sniper to reach the compound. Alive, Kim intercepted Taliban radio, communications indicating that the mortar crew was adjusting their fire based on spotters positioned in the surrounding hills. The next rounds would be more accurate, and the Taliban fighters were preparing to assault the compound as soon as the mortar fire stopped. "They're coordinating the indirect fire with a ground assault," Kim reported. "We've got maybe 2 minutes before they come through that breach in the wall." Jake made a command decision that would either save his team or doom them all. Instead of waiting for the enemy assault, they would use the tunnel system to launch their own counterattack. The Taliban fighters expected them to remain defensive, not to suddenly appear behind their positions. "Santos, Rodriguez, you're with me through the tunnels," Jake commanded. "Kim and Chen hold this position and provide covering fire for Thompson. We're going to hit them from behind while they're focused on the compound." The plan was desperate and dangerous, but it was their only chance of survival. 3 SEALs would have to navigate unknown tunnels, emerge behind enemy lines, and create enough chaos to disrupt the Taliban assault. Meanwhile, the remaining team members would have to hold the compound against overwhelming odds. Santos led the way into the tunnel system, using her earlier reconnaissance to guide them toward an exit that would put them behind the main enemy positions. The tunnels were narrow and dark, forcing them to move slowly to avoid making noise that might alert enemy fighters above ground. Thompson reached the compound breach just as the fourth mortar round exploded in the courtyard outside. She dove through the hole in the wall, landing hard on the rubble-strewn floor inside. Chen immediately began checking her for injuries while she caught her breath and reported on enemy positions. At least 40 fighters moving up the main approach. Thompson gasped. They've got RPGs, machine guns, and what looked like a recoilless rifle. They're planning to blow this place apart. Kim continued monitoring enemy communications while preparing defensive positions around the breach in the wall. The Taliban fighters were discussing their assault plan in detail, apparently confident that the trapped American soldiers couldn't understand their language. Rodriguez had remained in the compound to help defend the position, but he was also preparing a final surprise for the attacking force. If the compound was about to be overrun, he would detonate all of his remaining explosives simultaneously, potentially taking out dozens of enemy fighters in the resulting explosion. Underground, Jake's team moved through the tunnel system toward their planned emergence point. The passages were older than expected, possibly dating back to the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, when resistance fighters had built extensive tunnel networks throughout the mountains. Santos stopped the underground team at a junction where multiple tunnels converged. She could hear voices above them, indicating that Taliban fighters were positioned directly overhead. They would have to time their emergence carefully to avoid being detected before they could engage the enemy. Chen worked frantically to treat Thompson's injuries, which were more serious than initially apparent. Shrapnel from one of the mortar rounds had penetrated her leg, and she was losing blood at a dangerous rate. Without immediate treatment, she could go into shock within minutes. The fifth mortar round struck the compound's roof, sending chunks of concrete and wooden beams crashing down into the main room. Kim dove for cover as debris rained around his communications equipment. The radio antenna was damaged, reducing their ability to coordinate with base or call for emergency extraction. Thompson gritted her teeth as Chen worked on her leg wound. The shrapnel had missed major arteries, but the bleeding needed to be controlled immediately. She insisted on maintaining her weapon despite the pain, knowing that every rifle would be needed for the coming assault. "I can still fight," she told Chen between clenched teeth. "Just patch me up enough to keep shooting." Underground, Jake could hear the explosions above them getting closer to their planned emergence point. The tunnel system amplified sound in strange ways, making it difficult to determine exactly where enemy fighters were positioned. Santos held up her hand, signaling for silence as voices became audible directly overhead. Rodriguez prepared his final defensive measures in the compound. He had rigged the remaining Taliban ammunition caches with his explosives, creating a devastating surprise for anyone who tried to use the captured weapons against them. The explosions would also serve as a signal for Jake's team to begin their counterattack. Kim managed to re-establish brief contact with their base, despite the damaged antenna. Falcon Base, Eagle 6 compound under heavy mortar attack, casualties mounting. Request immediate air support, any available assets. The response was barely audible through the static and interference. Eagle 6, fast movers en route, ETA 20 minutes. Hold your position. 20 minutes felt like an eternity when facing immediate assault by 60 enemy fighters, but the promise of air support gave the defenders hope that they might survive long enough to be rescued. They just had to hold out until the aircraft arrived. Santos found the tunnel exit she had been seeking, a concealed opening that emerged behind a cluster of rocks where several Taliban fighters had positioned themselves. She could see their weapons and equipment through gaps in the stone, but they hadn't noticed the hidden tunnel entrance. The mortar fire suddenly stopped, replaced by shouted commands in Pashto as the Taliban fighters prepared for their final assault on the compound. Jake knew this was the moment of maximum danger and maximum opportunity. The enemy would be focused on their attack, making them vulnerable to surprise from behind. "Go, go, go," Jake whispered as Santos emerged from the tunnel and immediately engaged the nearest Taliban fighters with her rifle. The surprise was complete, and 3 enemy fighters fell before the others realized they were under attack from behind. Inside the compound, Rodriguez detonated his rigged ammunition caches as planned. The explosions created chaos among the attacking force and provided cover for Jake's team to continue their assault on the enemy's rear positions. Smoke and dust filled the air as secondary explosions rippled through Taliban equipment. Thompson forced herself to move despite her injuries, taking up a firing position near the breach in the wall. Her accurate rifle fire began picking off Taliban fighters who were caught between the compound's defenders and Jake's surprise attack from behind. The tide of battle was beginning to turn, but the fight was far from over. The Taliban force was large and experienced, and they quickly began adapting to the changed tactical situation. Some fighters turned to engage Jake's team while others continued pressing their attack on the compound. The counterattack from the tunnels created exactly the chaos Jake Morrison had hoped for, but it also put his small team in an extremely dangerous position. They were now fighting behind enemy lines with no cover except scattered rocks, facing Taliban fighters who were rapidly reorganizing to deal with this unexpected threat from their rear. Maria Santos moved from rock to rock, using her rifle to eliminate Taliban fighters who were trying to establish new defensive positions. Her years of combat experience allowed her to identify the most dangerous targets. First, the machine gunners and RPG operators, who could cause massive casualties if left unchecked. Mike Rodriguez emerged from the tunnel behind Santos, immediately engaging a group of Taliban fighters who had been preparing to assault the compound's main entrance. His accurate fire disrupted their attack formation and forced them to seek cover, buying precious time for the defenders inside the building. Inside the compound, Sarah Thompson fought through the pain of her leg wound to provide precision fire support for the counterattack. Despite her injury, her shooting remained deadly accurate, and she systematically eliminated Taliban fighters who posed the greatest threat to Jake's exposed team. Danny Kim worked frantically to repair his damaged communications equipment while maintaining defensive fire from inside the compound. The promise of air support in 20 minutes meant nothing if he couldn't guide the aircraft to their targets or coordinate the attack with their current tactical situation. Alex Chen had stabilized Thompson's bleeding, but he could see that she was beginning to show signs of shock from blood loss and pain. Her face was pale, and her hands were starting to shake despite her determined efforts to continue fighting. She needed immediate medical evacuation, but that was impossible under current circumstances. Jake moved between positions, coordinating his team's assault while engaging targets of opportunity with his rifle. The Taliban fighters were experienced and disciplined, but the surprise attack had disrupted their command structure and created confusion about where threats were coming from. The battle had now split into multiple separate firefights occurring simultaneously across the mountainside. Some Taliban fighters continued their assault on the compound. Others engaged Jake's counterattack team, and still others tried to reorganize their scattered forces into coherent defensive positions. Santos discovered that the Taliban force included several foreign fighters who appeared to be providing technical expertise and leadership. These men were better equipped and more tactically sophisticated than typical Taliban militia, suggesting this operation had been planned and supported by experienced military professionals. "Boss, we've got foreign advisors out here," Santos reported while changing magazines. "These guys know what they're doing, and they're trying to coordinate a response to our attack." Rodriguez used his demolitions expertise to create improvised explosive devices from captured Taliban equipment. He rigged several enemy ammunition caches to explode on command, creating additional chaos and denying the Taliban access to their own weapons and supplies. Thompson's condition was deteriorating despite Chen's medical treatment. The combination of blood loss, pain, and physical exertion was taking its toll on her ability to fight effectively. But she continued to engage targets, knowing that every Taliban fighter she eliminated increased her teammates' chances of survival. Kim successfully repaired enough of his communications equipment to re-establish contact with their base. Falcon Base Eagle 6. We have initiated counterattack and disrupted enemy assault. Air support critical for survival. Request immediate close air support on our position. The response was clearer now. Eagle 6, fast movers inbound, ETA 15 minutes. Prepare to mark targets with smoke or laser designation. Be advised, extraction helicopter will follow immediately after airstrike. 15 minutes still seemed like an eternity, but the knowledge that help was actually coming gave everyone renewed energy to continue fighting. They just had to survive a little longer and maintain their tactical advantage until the aircraft arrived. Jake identified the Taliban mortar position that had been causing so much damage to the compound. The crew was trying to relocate their weapon to continue the indirect fire attack, but they were now within range of his rifle. He began engaging the mortar team, forcing them to abandon their weapon. Santos flanked a group of Taliban fighters who had taken cover behind a large boulder. Her movement was covered by Rodriguez's suppressing fire, and she was able to eliminate 3 enemy fighters before they realized she had changed positions. The constant movement and aggressive tactics were keeping the Taliban off balance. The foreign advisors among the Taliban force began coordinating a more organized response to the SEAL counterattack. They were attempting to surround Jake's team and cut off their retreat route back to the tunnel system. The tactical situation was becoming increasingly complex and dangerous. Thompson made a difficult decision to change her firing position despite her injuries. From her new location, she could provide better support for Jake's team, but the movement required her to cross open ground while under enemy fire. Chen protested, but she insisted it was necessary for the team's survival. Rodriguez discovered that one of the Taliban ammunition caches contained rocket-propelled grenades that could be used against enemy positions. Although he wasn't familiar with the specific type of RPG, his demolitions training allowed him to figure out the basic operation quickly. Kim monitored Taliban radio frequencies and discovered that they were calling for additional reinforcements from other areas. The original attacking force of 60 fighters was about to be reinforced by another 30 or 40 fighters who were moving toward the battle area. "Boss, they're bringing up more fighters," Kim reported. "We could be facing over 100 hostiles if those reinforcements arrive before our air support." Jake realized that his counterattack had to achieve decisive results quickly, before the Taliban could reorganize and before additional enemy forces arrived. The next few minutes would determine whether his bold strategy succeeded or whether it had simply put his team in an even more dangerous position. Santos engaged the foreign advisors who were trying to coordinate the Taliban response. These men were clearly the key leaders of the enemy force, and eliminating them would disrupt the Taliban's ability to mount an effective defense against the coming airstrike. The sound of jet engines could be heard in the distance, still several minutes away but growing louder. The promise of close air support was becoming reality, but Jake's team had to survive long enough to benefit from it. The battle was entering its most critical phase, where seconds could determine the difference between rescue and catastrophe. Rodriguez fired his captured RPG at a group of Taliban fighters who were attempting to set up a machine gun position. The rocket exploded among them, eliminating the immediate threat and creating additional confusion among the enemy forces. But the explosion also revealed his position to other Taliban fighters, who began concentrating their fire on his location. The distinctive roar of F-16 Fighting Falcons filled the mountain valley as 2 aircraft appeared on the horizon, their engines screaming at low altitude. Jake Morrison felt a surge of relief mixed with urgency. Air support had arrived, but his team still had to survive the next few critical minutes while coordinating the attack. Danny Kim immediately began transmitting target coordinates to the incoming aircraft. Viper lead, Eagle 6. Multiple hostiles in prepared positions, coordinates as follows. Be advised, friendly forces are engaging from behind enemy lines. The lead pilot's voice came through clearly. Eagle 6, Viper lead. We have eyes on multiple heat signatures in your area. Need you to mark friendly positions immediately to avoid blue-on-blue engagement. Jake ordered his team to pop smoke grenades to identify their positions for the aircraft. Green smoke began rising from the compound while red smoke marked the location of his counterattack team behind enemy lines. The visual signals would help the pilots distinguish between friendly and enemy forces. Maria Santos continued her assault on the Taliban foreign advisors, recognizing that eliminating these key leaders would prevent the enemy from coordinating an effective response to the air attack. Her rifle fire was methodical and deadly, targeting the most tactically important enemies first. Sarah Thompson's condition had worsened significantly, but she refused to stop fighting. From her new position, she could see Taliban reinforcements approaching from the east and began engaging them at maximum range. Her accurate fire forced the reinforcements to take cover and slowed their advance toward the main battle. Mike, Rodriguez used his final RPG round against a Taliban machine gun position that was threatening to overrun the compound. The rocket struck the position directly, eliminating the immediate threat but also drawing concentrated enemy fire toward his location. He was forced to move quickly to avoid being overwhelmed. Alex Chen monitored Thompson's medical condition while maintaining defensive fire from the compound. She was showing clear signs of severe blood loss and shock, and he knew she would need immediate medical evacuation once the fighting ended. Her determination to continue fighting despite her condition inspired everyone around her. The first F-16 began its attack run, diving toward the Taliban positions with precision-guided munitions. The pilot had identified the largest concentration of enemy fighters and was preparing to eliminate them with a single devastating strike. "Viper lead, in hot," the pilot announced. "Danger close, all friendly forces take cover." Jake's team took cover behind rocks and in the tunnel entrance as the first bomb exploded among the Taliban positions. The concussion was enormous and the mountainside shook from the impact. Dozens of enemy fighters were eliminated instantly, and the survivors were stunned and disoriented. Kim coordinated with the second F-16 to target the Taliban reinforcements that Thompson had identified. The aircraft adjusted its approach to attack the enemy fighters who were attempting to join the main battle. From the east, Santos took advantage of the chaos created by the airstrike to advance on the remaining foreign advisors. These key enemy leaders were trying to rally their forces and coordinate a withdrawal, but her aggressive assault prevented them from regaining control of the tactical situation. The second airstrike eliminated most of the Taliban reinforcements before they could reach the main battle area. The explosion could be seen and felt throughout the valley, and the psychological impact on the surviving enemy fighters was immediate and devastating. Rodriguez rejoined Jake's counterattack team after the airstrikes, bringing captured Taliban equipment and ammunition. The enemy force had been reduced from over 60 fighters to perhaps 15 or 20 survivors, who were scattered and disorganized. Thompson's accurate sniper fire continued to eliminate fleeing Taliban fighters who were attempting to escape the devastation. Despite her deteriorating physical condition, her shooting remained deadly effective, preventing the enemy from establishing new defensive positions. Kim received word that the extraction helicopter was approaching the area and would arrive within 10 minutes. The rescue aircraft would provide additional firepower and, more importantly, immediate medical evacuation for Thompson and any other wounded team members. The remaining Taliban fighters began surrendering or fleeing as they realized their position was hopeless. The combination of the surprise counterattack and devastating airstrikes had completely destroyed their tactical advantage and eliminated most of their force. Santos captured one of the surviving foreign advisors, a man whose equipment and communications gear suggested he was a senior leader in the Taliban operation. Intelligence gathered from this prisoner could provide valuable information about future enemy plans and operations. Jake began consolidating his team's position and preparing for extraction. The immediate threat had been eliminated, but they needed to move quickly to secure the area and treat wounded personnel before additional enemy forces could arrive. Chen worked frantically to stabilize Thompson for medical evacuation. Her injuries required immediate surgical treatment that could only be provided at a major medical facility. The extraction helicopter would have advanced medical equipment, but the flight to the hospital would be critical. The extraction helicopter appeared over the ridgeline, its door gunner scanning for threats while the pilot identified a suitable landing zone near the compound. The aircraft's medical crew was already preparing to treat casualties during the flight to the nearest combat hospital. Rodriguez secured captured enemy equipment and intelligence materials that could provide valuable information about Taliban operations in the region. The elaborate ambush had been planned for weeks, and the materials might reveal other planned attacks against coalition forces. Kim re-established full communications with their base and began transmitting detailed after-action reports. The mission to capture the Ghost had failed, but the intelligence gathered and the enemy force eliminated represented a significant tactical victory. As the helicopter touched down in a whirlwind of dust and rotor wash, Jake Morrison looked at his team with pride and relief. They had walked into a carefully planned trap, been surrounded and outnumbered by a force more than 10 times their size, and fought their way out through courage, skill, and determination. Thompson was loaded onto the helicopter first, with Chen accompanying her to continue medical treatment during the flight. The rest of the team would follow on the next extraction flight, bringing their prisoner and captured intelligence materials. The Ghost had escaped again, but his elaborate ambush had been turned into a devastating defeat for his forces. Jake's team had proven that even when surrounded and overwhelmed, properly trained and determined soldiers could turn the tables on their enemies through aggressive action and tactical innovation. As the helicopter lifted off toward the medical facility, Jake realized that this mission would be remembered not as a failure to capture their target, but as an example of how American Special Operations Forces could overcome impossible odds through teamwork, courage, and the refusal to surrender even in the face of overwhelming enemy force.